Normal controllers are cumbersome, right? I mean, you need two hands to use them, there's a bunch of weird controls to memorize, especially in fighting games, and there's no real action. If I'm playing tennis, I don't want to have to just lazily press a button. I want to swing a racket. And if I'm playing a rhythm game, I actually want to dance to the music, not just press buttons. No one likes to do that. In come the motion controls. They're pretty self-explanatory. You input controls with real-life motion. Simple. I mean, sure, technically every controller is a motion controller because of the motion of your finger hitting a button causing a reaction to occur, but you know what I mean. Actual, physical, full swing motions being recognized in-game. Despite it seeming like a relatively new gimmick, motion controls have actually been around for a long time, dating back to the arcades. So let's take a look at the history of motion controls in video games, with their humble beginnings, the advancements of the modern day, and all the rough patches in between. Back in the day, the most popular forms of controls were either buttons or joysticks, maybe a racing wheel if you're lucky, but innovation had to start somewhere. One of the earliest examples of a video game with heavy emphasis on motion controls is Sega's Heavyweight Champ, released in 1976. It was an arcade cabinet that featured two boxing glove controllers, which could go up for high punches, down for low punches, and inward for striking. This is considered to be the first boxing video game, and what a start, I must say. Now, of course, this isn't really motion controls, but compared to just pressing a button or moving a joystick, this certainly is something else. And sure, you could classify racing games under motion controls, and in that case we'd have to date back to the 1940s, but that would be way too long. Also, fun fact, Heavyweight Champ is completely lost. At least the original version is. And only recently did we get footage of the game from CBS 8 San Diego, in which they released a 1977 news report about the Sega Center in 2020. My only gripe is that the reporter pronounced it Sega, not Sega.
To the new Sega Center in Fashion Valley.
Speaking of 1977, the Atari 2600. What an influential console. Not only popularizing the use of ROM cartridges, but also popularizing the trashing of them too. Yet the controller on this console was something, to say the least. I get it, this was an early era of video games and joysticks were all the rage in the arcades, so bringing it to the home market made sense. But my god, they could have made this feel better at least. So plenty of third parties made their own controllers for the console. And we got one from a company called Datasoft with their invention, Le Stick. Le Stick was an either 1981 or 82 controller that was just a stick, with a button on top. Might need to censor this. Much like a standard joystick, you'd move the stick forwards, backwards, left and right, and it would act accordingly. Again, not technically motion controls, even less so than Heavyweight Champ, but I'm giving it enough leeway. Now, was this controller good? No. So many people had issues with the controller and it not doing the right movements. Now, its clunkiness is the same reason as why this controller is dangerous. The way it detects movement is a mercury orientation sensor, meaning that liquid mercury would connect two prongs to deliver electricity down the wire and into the console. This wasn't a new technology at the time, pinball machines had used it to detect if players were tilting for ages, but mercury is not fun stuff. If that leaked, you'd win a one-way trip to the hospital. Sticking with Atari, after the whole fiasco, they apparently went on and tried to develop something extraordinary, something definitely ahead of its time. The Atari MindLink was developed in the early 80s, scheduled for release in 1984. Despite this, it never came out. I wonder why. The controller was a headband, and it would read your forehead and eyebrow movements with infrared sensors, and then input controls accordingly. 3 games were developed, one being unknown as far as I can tell, one being a breakout clone, and one having fake ESP, pretending to predict what would be on cards. Crazily enough, moving the eyebrows around for extended periods of time is unpleasant and caused headaches, so Jack Tramiel and his sons canceled the development of the MindLink, seeing it as a toy rather than an actual controller. Back to the arcades, racing games have been a thing for a long while, again dating back to the 40s, but Sega was the first to go, "It's not immersive enough!" So in their 1985 game Hang On, the deluxe cabinet had a full-on motorcycle that you would ride and tilt to move your character in-game. And I bet it was really immersive when someone tilted a little too far and just... The NES helped add video games back into the homes of many, but that didn't slow down the development of motion controls. You might think Konami's Dance Dance Revolution came up with this dance pad design. Well, f*** you, Nintendo was there first. They always are. The Power Pad, or Family Trainer in Japan and Family Fun Fitness in Europe, released in 1986. Here in the States, it released in 1987 alongside the game Athletic World, with the Power Pad having a Family Fun Fitness branding to it, which would eventually be removed in future Power Pad releases. As you would expect, the game required you to run, jump, and overall move around on the Power Pad to input controls. A lot of the games were released as a part of the Family Trainer series by Bandai, who originally developed the Power Pad. Despite this, it never really caught on and only had 11 games produced for it. But this wasn't the only thing Nintendo did for the NES that involved motion controls. The Power Glove was even worse. The Power Glove released in 1989 and was a controller that you put your hand into, tilting and moving it around to input controls. It used ultrasonic speakers in the glove and microphones around the TV to figure out where the glove was, and to then perform the correct inputs into the NES. Now, while the Power Glove sold over 1 million units, outperforming the Virtual Boy, it had a grand total of 2 games released specifically for it. So the Power Glove and the Virtual Boy are even. These 2 games were Super Glove Ball, a maze game where you use the glove to punch a ball around and break tiles, and Bad Street Brawler, a simple beat-em-up game. Now, technically, the Power Glove is just an NES controller, and it was actually marketed as an alternative controller in Japan, so all the games that were Power Glove compatible could easily be played with the normal NES controller, and vice versa for all other NES games. Despite its large sales numbers, the Power Glove was basically a failure. Although we really can't blame Nintendo, as they weren't the ones to develop or release the Power Glove, as it was by Mattel. I'm still blaming Nintendo. We're still not done with the NES. Here comes in Broderbund with the U-Force, a controller that you use by not touching it. Probably modeled in the likeness of a theremin, the U-Force uses infrared light beams to detect the presence of your hands, which would then correspond to a button. The U-Force even had analog support, meaning that instead of a button being either on or off, it could be any number of states in between, although no games actually made use of it. It also came with accessories to make certain games more immersive, like a flight stick, which is actually pretty cool. It uses the IR sensor to see where it's moving, of course, but it also has triggers on the top, which, when they're pressed, they'll flip a reflector on the bottom which bounces the IR beam back, signaling to the game to fire. Honestly, that's pretty cool. But everyone else hated this thing, with MSN calling it, quote, a truly nightmarish controller. In comes Power to the 10th to give us the hot seat and the hot stick. The hot seat was, as you would expect, a seat that you would sit in. You would control the D-pad by tilting yourself in the seat, and there would be a joystick at the front of the right armrest that you would use for all the other buttons. Now, everything is contained within the joystick portion of the seat, so in reality, this is just a beefed up lace stick. Speaking of, Power to the 10th actually decided to make a new lace stick, and called it the Hot Stick. This was released both for the NES and the Sega Genesis, being the first controller here to be put into the 16-bit era. But the Hot Stick is pretty much just lace stick, but for a different console. While their designs are different, their functions are the same, even down to the liquid mercury tilt switches. The Hot Seat probably uses tilt switches too, but it's unknown if they're metal balls or mercury. Nintendo couldn't have all the fun of having all this cool motion-based technology, so Sega decided to start making their own, introducing the Sega Activator, an octagonal controller that you'd place on the floor, released in 1993. Much like the U-Force, it uses infrared. When you move a body part over one of the 8 sides, it would then input the control. And I do mean body parts, as games like Mortal Kombat were used to demo the thing, where kicks were done by actually kicking. Rest in peace to those who had a small room. Either way, it was deemed garbage for its poor performance and high price point, which was close to $160 today. Sega were also in the process of making the Sega VR, a virtual reality headset for the Genesis. The headset itself actually had motion controls via, quote, internal sensors that were apparently pretty accurate and was shown up at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in 1993 and was planned for a release in 1994. But due to concerns over injuries and motion sickness from the console, the Sega VR was postponed and later cancelled. And yes, this predates the Virtual Boy. Maybe Nintendo should have taken a note from this. And as a simple wrap-up for this section, Konami's Dance Dance Revolution. The series as a whole has its own unique dance pad, where players have to perform the inputs on screen by pressing their feet on the corresponding section of the pad. It can get pretty intense, hence the bars behind the pad, allowing for players to hold on so they can move their legs and feet around more easily. But somehow, they got it right by making it only usable with this certain niche, and ever since its original 1998 release, DDR has been insanely popular. Konami does what Nintendo don't. But now Y2K is upon us, and while there is stuff to talk about, it feels empty. But it's probably because we all know what comes next. Either way, let's start off with another Konami invention: Police 911. Police 911 is a 2000 arcade game where you have to shoot the bad guys and not get shot yourself. Much like other arcade games of the time, it used a light gun to shoot at enemies. But to dodge enemy bullets, you'd have to actually move your body and get out of the way. This cabinet used infrared sensors above the player to see where they're moving. Although there's these poles on either side of where you stand, so ducking in just the right way will definitely get you a concussion. Back to Nintendo with Kirby Tilt and Tumble, a Game Boy Color game released in 2000. It's a standard Kirby affair, but with accelerometers in the cartridge, allowing for the main function of the game to work, which is tilting the game console. Accelerometers are complex for my idiot brain, but for what we're concerned with, they measure the acceleration along the X, Y, and Z axes, the left, right, up, down, and forward, backward movements. For example, shoving a controller forward causes it to detect that on the Z axis. Accelerometers can even detect rotation, but in a broad sense. Crazily enough, it actually worked pretty well, and was considered a pretty good game. In 2003, Sony probably saw into the future what Microsoft would end up doing, so they decided to try their hands with a controller that just used your body and required little setup. Enter the iToy, a PlayStation 2 add-on that was basically a glorified webcam. It didn't use things like infrared or anything of that sort. It was quite literally just looking at the images from the camera and trying to see what parts of it were a person. Although it was a bit clunky, it did apparently work well enough, and got plenty of releases that either supported the iToy or outright required it. But no one talks about it, so who cares? Apparently, the same thing happened with the Japanese company SSD Company Limited looking into the future of Nintendo and deciding that they needed to get there first. So in 2004, they released the Zavix port. This was a console that had various controllers that would use infrared to communicate wirelessly to the console. Although this may sound very familiar, the keyword there is various. For every game that came out, there was basically a new controller that came with it. Despite this, it worked. It's just inconvenient to now have to make room for like 10 unique controllers. Another dedicated game from Nintendo along with Intelligent Systems, WarioWare Twisted. Released in 2004, this game is your standard WarioWare affair, but with you needing to move the console for the microgames. This is done with a gyroscope in the cartridge, with an added rumble in there as a bonus. Gyroscopes, in contrast to accelerometers, measure rotation around the pitch, yaw, and roll axes. This helps to provide better, more precise data on the rotation and the orientational movements. The game was critically acclaimed, considered to be one of, if not the best game for the GBA. Now we're into the 7th generation of consoles, but we're not to the big boom of motion controls yet, although they were highly anticipated during this time. Despite this, the Sony PlayStation 3 released in 2006 with the 6-axis controller. Originally looking like the funniest damn thing I've ever seen, this controller allowed for it to be moved within the 6 degrees of freedom, both translation and rotation, by an accelerometer and gyroscope, hence the name 6-axis. It's also a palindrome, so that's cool. Many games made use of the 6-axis accelerometer controls, but most games allow you to use the buttons on the front instead. Also, because of the motion controls, 6-axis lost rumble features. But then Nintendo said, "F y'all, fight me," and dropped the Wii in 2006. The Wii was a motion-based system first, which had both its benefits and its flaws. Either way, we got the Wii Remote, a rectangular brick with some buttons on it. It communicated to the Wii via Bluetooth, but used an accelerometer for movement and an IR sensor for pointing. The accompanying nunchuck also had an accelerometer, and it worked, but it wasn't the best right out of the box, because again, the accelerometer on its own can be a bit inaccurate, but it worked well enough, and because of its shape and how the Wii marketed itself, it made sense. It was so good in fact that it broadened the Wii's age ranges and brought the family together so that everyone can see you chuck the Wii Remote into the TV at Mach 10. Everything else before the Wii walked so that the Wii Remote could run. This was the future, or so we thought. Sony then realized that the 6-axis not having rumble support caused riots, so they made the DualShock 3, which just added haptic feedback to the controller. But it still kept all the motion features, even as the DualShock evolved. The DualShock 3 released in 2007, and the subsequent controllers, the DualShock 4 in 2013, and the DualSense in 2020, both had motion capabilities. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. Then, in 2008, 6sense developed the True Motion, a dual controller setup that used weak magnetic fields to detect motion. These fields would be in a base that the controllers would be wired into. The True Motion would then be taken up by Razer and renamed to the Hydra, and was officially released in 2011. Surprisingly enough, Plenty of games support the Hydra, but there's been no game that outright needs it. A wireless version was in the works, but it seems to not have been released, and even Razer no longer sells the Hydra on their website. But this was a $140 controller with a motion gimmick. I'd rather just use my $140 keyboard, thanks. Asus then tried to join the craze with the E-Stick, released in 2008. It came bundled with a few ePCs and eBox PCs, and included some games to accompany them. Like the Hydra, it came with two controllers, one that had an analog stick and one with a D-pad. Asus advertised it as not only being for games, but for business as well, with it acting something akin to like a slideshow clicker. It also apparently acted like a mouse, allowing for movement of the cursor from far away. But to be honest, did anyone even know this existed? The Wii Remote was cool and all, but the accelerometers themselves were just not enough for what the Wii said it was capable of doing. So in 2009, Nintendo came out with the Wii Motion Plus, an add-on for the Wii Remote that gave us better movement with the gyroscope. This did mean that certain games required this add-on, like Wii Sports Resort and Wii Play Motion, but it was pretty good at its job and even improved games that didn't require it. It just requires you to recalibrate it every 2 seconds. And in 2010, Nintendo integrated Motion Plus with Wii Remotes, giving us the Wii Remote Plus. Fun fact, this was leaked because of Fling Smash. Because of course it fucking did. Sony then came back and said, "We can do that too!" and gave us the PlayStation Move in 2010. This was a two-parter, having both the wand and the PlayStation Eye, a glorified camera similar to the Eye toy. The PlayStation Eye actually released in 2007, but it was just another Eye toy. The PlayStation Move required it, using it to identify where the glowing orbs of the wands were during gameplay. Despite this, the wands actually also have accelerometers, angular rate sensors, and magnetometers. The angular rate sensor has the same purpose as a gyroscope, measuring rotation, and the magnetometer helps to counteract the Earth's magnetic field, thus avoiding drift from the other two sensors. Despite it being a blatant clone of the Wii Remote, it was received extremely well, even receiving the 2010 Popular Science Award for the most immersive game controller. But then Microsoft just had to dip their toes into the motion controls market, and they wanted something better. No controllers to hold, just move your body. They then came up with the Kinect in 2010. The Kinect uses an RGB camera to make it an oversized webcam, and a depth sensor using infrared to capture the video data in 3D. And the craziest part is that it worked. Mostly. It had a bit of a rough start, but it improved pretty well over time. The Kinect was then able to be used on Windows, the Xbox One, very controversially, and even Windows Azure. I don't know. It's been less marketed for games and more marketed for business now, for hands-free operations of computers. Either way, it won several awards, but had some mixed reviews. The next 2 years, 2011 and 2012, Nintendo released their next consoles, the Nintendo 3DS and Wii U, both of which had motion support. The 3DS included the standard 6-axis motion sensor and accelerometer and gyroscope, but the Wii U's gamepad had a 9-axis sensor, with the same accelerometer and gyro, as well as a 3-axis magnetometer. It even features an IR sensor that can substitute for the Wii sensor bar if needs be. Of course, there are games that heavily feature the use of these motion controls, but it feels like they were outshined by other gimmicks of the consoles. This really does start to mark an end for the golden era. But there's one more I'll include: Sony's PlayStation camera. Released in 2013 for the PlayStation 4, it was basically the PlayStation version of the Kinect. The PlayStation camera actually had two cameras, allowing for depth perception. Also, one camera could be used for recording, while one could be used for motion tracking, for example. Now, it worked, but there is basically no need for it. 35 games have PS camera support, 9 of which are just dance games. And again, that's just support, not a requirement. It definitely didn't take off like the Kinect. But the dust has now settled, the golden era is over, and motion controls seem more like a gimmick by the passing day. Where do we go from here? Well, let's get back to the basics with normal controllers with motion support built in. Valve's Steam controller released in 2015, and as you would expect at this point, it has 6-axis sensing with an accelerometer and gyroscope. Apparently, according to the most reliable source ever, Reddit commenters, the controller actually has insanely good motion controls, giving it immense praise. It's also not automatically on, making you touch the right pad and then move the controller around. And because it's kind of like a beefed up mouse, it works pretty well. Honestly, pretty neat. But we're in the future, and we can finally do what Sega tried to do decades ago: virtual reality. Oculus VR, now known as Reality Labs, released the Rift, or more precisely the Rift CV1, in 2016. The Rift uses two constellation sensors that detect, say it with me, infrared light that the headset itself would emit. Near the end of 2016, Oculus released the touch controllers, which operate in the same way, emitting IR light which the constellation sensors detect. The Rift was indeed a rift into the new world of virtual reality, but also into a great world of watching your friends stumble around like an idiot looking like a madman while playing super hot. I'm totally not speaking from experience. Then Sony, as they do, decided to try their hand in the VR space, making the PlayStation VR in 2016. The VR headset needed the PlayStation camera to work, so that it can detect the LEDs on its surface. No special controllers, just the DualShock 4, the PlayStation camera, and the PlayStation Move, but the PSVR had good reviews, especially for its minimal cables, something that can be said for the Rift. Now we're getting to the more modern day with Nintendo's latest and greatest, the Switch. The Switch came with the Joy-Cons, tiny controllers that can do it all, and as such they have motion controls with the standard 6-axis sensing that I'm sure you've heard me whittle on about for far too long now. And yeah, they work, but it seems that the Joy-Cons are being compared to the Wii Remote, which just isn't fair. They're still good for something like the Sizzling Steaks or Candy Shakedown games in Super Mario Party, but they should be evaluated on their own. There's also the Switch Pro controller, with the same 6-axis sensing. Nothing else really to say because it's just a controller that happens to have the sensors in it. But hey, now we're in the era where motion controls are used for one thing, and one thing only, VR. In 2019, Facebook partnered with Lenovo for the Oculus Rift S, a successor to the Rift CV1. The major difference here is the lack of the constellation sensors. Instead, the headset itself contained accelerometers and gyroscopes, as well as 5 cameras around the headset. These cameras would help drift made by the accelerometers and gyros by mapping out the room, knowing where it is at all time. These cameras also detect the IR coming off the touch controllers. This is all a part of Oculus Insight. There even is artificial intelligence gunk built in that help guess where the controllers are if they happen to be out of sight of the headset. Facebook then, a few months later, released the Oculus Quest, which would then be renamed to the Meta Quest when Facebook really wanted to make sure that everyone knew who owned Oculus. The Quest uses the same touch controllers, although upgraded to a second version that worked better with Oculus Insight, but they also allowed for flat-out hand recognition in 2020. Using Insight and machine learning. Of course, there was also the Quest 2 released in 2020, but the main thing that changed with it was the hand tracking being insanely better in 2022. Taking a break from VR, in 2022, Valve came into the scene with the Steam Deck, their first games machine. It too has a 6-axis motion control setup and operated pretty much identically to the Steam controller. Hold the right pad and move. And because it's basically a Steam controller with a built-in computer, it works flawlessly, maybe even more so depending on the game. Sony then improved the PSVR with the PlayStation VR 2 in 2023. The VR 2, instead of needing the PlayStation camera, opted to go with the Oculus method of tracking, with 4 cameras on the outside that detect both movement for the headset as well as the new controllers, the VR2 Sense controllers. You can also use the DualSense if needs be, but the new Sense controllers are what's important. The Sense controllers, much like the Oculus Touch controllers, emit infrared light that the cameras detect. And that's the present, but let's move into the future with Apple's Vision Pro. Scheduled for release in 2024, the Vision Pro's controls are your hands. Yeah, there's no controllers, it's just your hands. Yeah, Meta got there first, but Apple's doing it from the get-go. The Vision Pro has a pair of cameras that it uses to not only capture the world around you, but to also track your head and hand movements. And apparently, your hand can even be seen from a lot of places, not just in front of the headset. Being lazy in VR has never been easier. Also, I know this technically isn't a gaming-oriented thing, but I can say without a doubt that gaming stuff is going to be on here in no time. Motion controls have been around for a long time, and the methods that have been used for ages still seem to hold up in some regards, just with a little less mercury poisoning. From a gimmick to a necessity, motion controls have had their ups and downs, but they work, most of the time. In my case, they formed my childhood, and probably many of yours too, and it seems like they're gonna form our future. For better, or for worse. It's definitely for the worse.